Melody Harper, a white executive, watches in stunned silence as security escorts James Washington, the black CEO of Skyline Airways, off his own private jet. The intercom announces, "Ms. Harper, as the new majority shareholder, what would you like us to do with Mr. Washington's belongings?" Melody's face drains of color as she realizes what she's inadvertently set in motion. Before we dive into this incredible story of privilege, power, and redemption, where are you watching from today? Hit that like button and subscribe to follow more stories about racial justice in corporate America. Now let's rewind and see how this shocking confrontation came to be. The thunderstorm brewing outside Newark International Airport mirrored the storm about to erupt in Melody Harper's life. The terminal buzzed with frustrated travelers as flight delays scrolled across departure boards. Melody, a 38-year-old marketing executive with perfectly highlighted blonde hair and a designer pantsuit, rushed through the crowded terminal, her wheeled carry-on clicking rhythmically behind her. Final boarding call for Skyline Airways Flight 457 to Atlanta, the announcement echoed as Melody quickened her pace. She had spent the entire day in back-to-back meetings with potential clients, and this final flight to Atlanta would determine whether her exhausting day had been worth it. Tomorrow morning, she was scheduled to present a comprehensive marketing strategy to Southern Beverage Corporation, a client that could potentially double her firm's annual revenue. Breathless, she handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, who barely glanced at it before waving her through. The jetway was empty, a clear sign she was the last passenger to board. As she stepped onto the aircraft, the flight attendant greeted her with a practiced smile. "Welcome aboard, Miss Harper. We've been waiting for you." Melody nodded curtly and made her way to first class. As she approached seat 2A, her assigned window seat, she found it already occupied. A distinguished black man in his mid-40s sat there, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit and focused intently on his laptop. Gold cufflinks caught the cabin light as his fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard. Melody cleared her throat. "Excuse me, I believe you're in my seat." James Washington looked up, his expression momentarily confused. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced his boarding pass. "I don't think so. Seat 2A is mine," he replied, his voice deep and measured. Melody felt her face flush. She had been looking forward to settling into her window seat, enjoying a glass of pre-flight champagne, and reviewing her presentation notes. "Let me see that," she said, reaching for his boarding pass while holding out her own. "Look, mine clearly says 2A. James examined both passes, his brow furrowed. "That's strange. Mine also says 2A. By now, Zoe Reynolds, a 32-year-old white flight attendant with a sleek ponytail, had noticed the commotion and approached them. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her eyes darting between Melody and James. Before James could speak, Melody interjected, "Yes, there is. This gentleman is in my assigned seat." Zoe glanced at Melody's boarding pass, then at James, her expression shifting subtly. Without asking to see James's pass, she turned to him. "Sir, perhaps there's been a mistake. Would you mind taking another seat so we can depart on time?" James opened his mouth as if to protest, then looked around at the curious faces of nearby passengers. His shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly. "Fine," he said quietly, gathering his belongings. "I wouldn't want to delay anyone's travel plans." As James moved to another first-class seat, Melody settled into 2A, arranging her items in the seat pocket in front of her. She couldn't help but overhear whispers from passengers behind her. "Did you see that? They just assumed he was wrong," one passenger murmured. "Typical," another replied. "Guy looks like he belongs in first class more than half the people here, and still gets bumped." Melody shifted uncomfortably but pushed the comments from her mind. Growing up in Brookline, an affluent suburb of Boston, Massachusetts, she had been largely sheltered from conversations about racial tensions. Her parents, both successful attorneys, had raised her to believe that hard work alone determined success. The concept that her whiteness might afford her unearned advantages had never been part of her worldview. As the flight took off into increasingly turbulent skies, Melody tried to focus on her presentation. However, she found herself repeatedly distracted by James, who was now seated across the aisle. Despite being displaced, he worked efficiently, making several business calls that Melody found irritating. The phrases quarterly projections, board meeting, and shareholder value drifted across the aisle. Some people have no consideration, she thought to herself, reaching for her noise-canceling headphones. Little did she know that those overheard conversations would soon change the course of both their lives. The plane had been in the air for approximately 45 minutes when Melody noticed James's demeanor change dramatically. His phone had rung, apparently some first-class passengers still received service despite the aircraft's altitude, and his calm professionalism had instantly evaporated. "What do you mean, a hostile takeover?" James's voice was hushed but intense, carrying just far enough for Melody to catch fragments of the conversation. "That's impossible. The board can't move without my knowledge." Despite herself, Melody found her attention drawn to the conversation. She pretended to review documents while listening intently. "Richard has no authority to call an emergency meeting," James continued, his knuckles whitening around his phone. "I don't care what Franklin Harper's granddaughter has to do with this. She's never shown any interest in the airline industry." Melody nearly dropped her tablet. Franklin Harper, her grandfather's name had just come up in this stranger's conversation. Before she could process this bizarre coincidence, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to severe thunderstorms in the Atlanta area, we've been diverted to Charlotte Douglas International Airport. We apologize for the inconvenience and will update you with further information once we're on the ground." A collective groan rose from the cabin. Melody watched as James ended his call, his face a mask of controlled concern. For the remainder of the flight, he made several more calls, each one more urgent than the last. 40 minutes later, the plane touched down in Charlotte. As passengers began the process of deplaning, Melody gathered her belongings, accidentally grabbing a laptop bag identical to hers from beneath the seat in front of her. In her haste to reach the terminal and find information about connecting flights, she didn't notice the mix-up. Inside the crowded terminal, Melody found a quiet corner near a charging station. With no immediate information about continuing flights to Atlanta, she decided to review her presentation one last time. Opening what she thought was her laptop bag, she immediately realized her mistake. The sleek black computer inside wasn't hers. "Great," she muttered, searching for identification to locate the owner. As she opened the laptop, hoping to find contact information, the screen illuminated to reveal an open document. The letterhead caught her eye immediately: Skyline Airways, Confidential, Board of Directors. Ethical considerations momentarily forgotten, Melody scanned the document. It detailed the airline's current financial situation, which appeared precarious despite record passenger numbers. References to leadership concerns and transition planning peppered the text. As she scrolled further, a name jumped out at her: Franklin Harper, her grandfather who had passed away 6 months earlier. According to the document, his shares in Skyline Airways, 35% of the company, had transferred to his sole heir upon his death. "That's impossible," Melody whispered to herself. Her relationship with her grandfather had been strained at best, non-existent at worst. The cantankerous old man had never approved of her career choices, calling marketing a waste of a Harvard education. They hadn't spoken in years before his death, and she had sent her regrets to the funeral, too busy with a product launch to attend. Yet here, in black and white, was evidence that Franklin Harper had left her a substantial ownership stake in a major airline. One she had never even known he was involved with. Her hands trembling, Melody pulled out her phone and called her financial advisor. "Derek, it's Melody Harper. I need information about my inheritance from my grandfather, specifically any holdings in Skyline Airways." After a brief hold, Derek returned with confirmation that stunned her. "Yes, Ms. Harper, you currently hold approximately 35% of Skyline Airways shares." They were transferred to your portfolio 6 months ago. I believe we discussed this during our quarterly review, though you seemed uninterested in the airline holdings at the time. Melody vaguely recalled dismissing information about miscellaneous transportation investments during that meeting, too focused on tech stocks to pay attention. What's the current value of those shares? She asked. They've depreciated significantly in recent months, Derek replied. There are rumors of mismanagement. In fact, if you were interested, this would be an opportune time to increase your position at a favorable price. As Derek spoke, Melody spotted James Washington across the terminal, engaged in what appeared to be an intense phone conversation. The man who had refused to give up her seat, or was it his seat, was clearly distressed. A plan began forming in Melody's mind. A reckless, impulsive plan born of wounded pride and the opportunity for petty revenge. Derek, I want to purchase additional shares of Skyline Airways. Immediately. Enough to give me controlling interest. Ms. Harper, that would require using a significant portion of your trust fund. Are you certain? Absolutely certain, Melody interrupted. And Derek, find out who Richard Klein is. I believe he's on the board of directors. Within 30 minutes, Derek had arranged for Melody to purchase an additional 16% of Skyline Airways shares, giving her a 51% majority stake in the company. He had also connected her with Richard Klein, her grandfather's longtime friend and business associate, who seemed suspiciously eager to facilitate her sudden interest in the airline. My dear, this is wonderful news, Richard's voice oozed through the phone. Your grandfather always hoped you would take an interest in the family business. We're having an emergency board meeting here in Charlotte to discuss the company's future. As the new majority shareholder, your presence would be most appropriate. Of course, Melody replied, watching James pace anxiously across the terminal. Where and when? The corporate hangar at the private aviation section of the airport. 1 hour. I'll text you the details, Richard said. And Ms. Harper? Perhaps we should keep your new position confidential until the meeting. No need to cause unnecessary disturbance. As she ended the call, Melody noticed James approaching the customer service desk, clearly taking charge of the situation as frustrated passengers gathered around. His commanding presence and calm authority as he addressed both staff and customers gave her a momentary pang of doubt about her impulsive decision. But then she remembered how he had made her feel, embarrassed and challenged in front of a plane full of strangers. No, she decided, she would attend this board meeting and see just what kind of power she now wielded over James Washington's future. Charlotte Douglas International Airport buzzed with displaced passengers frantically rebooking flights as the summer thunderstorm continued to wreak havoc on the eastern seaboard's flight schedules. Melody sat in a quiet corner of the first-class lounge, her mind reeling from the information Derek had just shared during their follow-up call. Your grandfather's shares were originally purchased 20 years ago when Skyline was a struggling regional carrier, Derek explained. The company's value has increased nearly 30-fold since then, making your inheritance quite substantial despite recent setbacks. And what about the current management? Melody asked, watching James Washington across the lounge as he efficiently coordinated with his team via phone. James Washington has been CEO for 7 years. By all accounts, he's well respected in the industry. Started as a flight operations manager and worked his way up. The company's financial difficulties began only recently, coinciding with some aggressive moves by competitors. Melody twirled a strand of hair around her finger, a habit from childhood that emerged when she was deep in thought. What happens if I exercise my rights as majority shareholder? Could I make changes to leadership? Derek's hesitation was palpable even through the phone. Technically, yes. With 51% ownership, you could vote in a new board, which could then replace the CEO. But Melody, this is a multi-billion-dollar company with thousands of employees. This isn't like changing marketing strategies for a client. These decisions affect real lives. I understand, she replied, though in truth, she was already imagining the look on James Washington's face when he realized the woman he had dismissed on the plane now controlled his professional fate. I need to go. The board meeting starts soon. As she gathered her belongings, she noticed James ending his call, a rare smile crossing his features. Whatever crisis he had been managing appeared to be temporarily resolved. She watched as he took a moment to help an elderly passenger with her rebooking, his patience and kindness evident even from across the room. For a split second, Melody felt a twinge of shame about her vindictive motivations. But then she remembered the humiliation she had felt on the plane, and her resolve hardened. She would attend this board meeting and assert her newfound authority. A sleek black town car awaited her outside the terminal, courtesy of Richard Klein. As the driver navigated through the airport complex toward the private aviation area, Melody rehearsed what she would say. She had sat through countless corporate takeovers in her marketing career, though always as the consultant brought in after leadership changes. Now she would be the one initiating the shakeup. The private hangar loomed ahead, the Skyline Airways logo, a stylized horizon with wings, illuminated against the darkening sky. A group of men in expensive suits stood beneath an awning, sheltered from the intermittent rain. Richard Klein, a silver-haired man with ruddy cheeks and a politician's smile, stepped forward as her car approached. "Ms. Harper, what a pleasure to finally meet you in person," he said, offering his hand. "Your grandfather spoke of you often." "Did he?" Melody replied coolly, knowing this was almost certainly a lie. How curious, since he rarely spoke to me. If Richard was fazed by her directness, he didn't show it. Franklin was a complicated man, but he built a tremendous legacy. A legacy that is now yours to steer. He gestured toward the hangar where a Gulfstream G650 sat gleaming under bright lights. The board is assembling on the corporate jet. More comfortable than the hangar offices, and we can speak freely there. As they walked toward the aircraft, Richard lowered his voice. "I should mention that James Washington will be joining us shortly. He's been informed of an urgent board meeting but doesn't yet know about your position. We thought it best to present everything at once." Melody nodded, a mixture of anticipation and apprehension building in her chest. As she climbed the stairs to the private jet, she was struck by the opulence. Butter-soft leather seats, polished wood tables, and a fully stocked bar greeted her. 5 men in various stages of middle age rose as she entered, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and calculation. "Gentlemen, allow me to introduce Melody Harper, Franklin's granddaughter and the new majority shareholder of Skyline Airways," Richard announced. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of introductions and thinly veiled assessments. Board member Walter Simmons made no effort to hide his skepticism about her sudden appearance. Thomas Fletcher, the CFO, seemed particularly interested in her plans for the company's financial structure. Throughout it all, Melody maintained the cool, confident demeanor she had perfected in countless corporate boardrooms. "And what exactly is your experience in the airline industry, Ms. Harper?" asked Walter, swirling his scotch. Before Melody could respond, the jet's door opened, and James Washington stepped inside. He froze momentarily when he saw Melody, recognition flickering across his features. "You're the woman from the plane," he said, confusion evident in his voice. Richard stepped forward smoothly. "James, allow me to properly introduce Melody Harper, Franklin Harper's granddaughter and the new majority shareholder of Skyline Airways." The color drained from James's face as the implications of this statement registered. His eyes darted between the board members, searching for some explanation or ally. Finding neither, he straightened his shoulders and addressed Melody directly. "Ms. Harper, this is certainly unexpected. I was unaware that Franklin had passed his shares to family. Perhaps we could discuss the company's current strategies and future plans in private after this meeting. I'm sure you have questions." His composure impressed Melody, but Richard interjected before she could respond. "Actually, James, that's why we've called this emergency meeting. Given the company's recent challenges, Ms. Harper has expressed interest in taking a more active role in leadership." "More active role?" James repeated, his voice steady despite the obvious tension. "I welcome any input from our shareholders, of course." What Richard means, Melody found herself saying, is that as majority shareholder, I'm exploring all options for Skyline's future direction. The implication hung in the air. James's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he maintained his professional demeanor. I see. And this decision comes after your extensive analysis of our quarterly reports, strategic initiatives, and market position? The slight emphasis on extensive wasn't lost on Melody. For a moment, she saw herself through his eyes, a privileged white woman who had inherited power she hadn't earned, now wielding it capriciously over a black man who had worked his way to the top of an industry not known for its diversity. The image made her uncomfortable, but Richard quickly filled the silence. The board has prepared a resolution for an immediate leadership transition period, he said, producing documents from his briefcase. During this time, James would step back from CEO duties while Ms. Harper and the board assessed the company's direction. This is highly irregular, James said, his calm facade beginning to crack. There are protocols for leadership changes, not to mention contractual obligations. Protocols that the majority shareholder can expedite, Richard countered smoothly. It's all perfectly legal. As the men around her nodded in agreement, Melody had a sudden flashback to her childhood. She had been 7 years old, visiting her grandfather's office for the first and only time. While the adults talked, she had wandered down a hallway and discovered a room where black custodial staff were eating lunch, segregated from the executive dining room. When she'd asked her grandfather about it later, he dismissed her question with a wave of his hand. That's just how things are, Melody. Some people are meant to lead, others to follow. The memory, long buried, surfaced with uncomfortable clarity as she watched James Washington, a man who had clearly defied such limitations, now facing the prospect of losing everything he'd built because of her whim. But before she could voice any reservations, the board moved with surprising speed. A vote was called, with only James objecting to the temporary leadership transition. Within minutes, security personnel appeared at the jet's door. This is absurd, James said, his voice finally betraying his anger. You can't just remove me without cause. The cause is the company's declining performance, Richard replied coldly. A situation that predates Ms. Harper's involvement but requires decisive action nonetheless. As security approached James, Melody suddenly realized she had set in motion something she didn't fully understand, and might not be able to control. Gentlemen, perhaps we should, she began, but it was too late. Ms. Harper, as the new majority shareholder, what would you like us to do with Mr. Washington's belongings? The head of security asked as James was escorted toward the door, his expression a mixture of disbelief and barely contained fury. Melody sat frozen in the CEO's chair, the reality of what she had done finally sinking in. What do you think of Melody's decision? Comment number 1 if you believe she was justified in exercising her shareholder rights, or comment number 2 if you think she acted impulsively without understanding the consequences. Like and subscribe to see what happens next in this power struggle. Will Melody realize the impact of her actions, or will she embrace her new role as owner of Skyline Airways? Let's find out. The door to the private jet closed with a soft pneumatic hiss, sealing Melody inside with the board members who had just orchestrated the removal of James Washington. Rain pelted against the windows, mirroring the storm of emotions brewing inside her. She sat in the plush leather chair, James's chair, feeling oddly hollow despite her supposed victory. Well, that's settled, Richard Klein said, breaking the silence as he poured himself a celebratory scotch. Congratulations, Ms. Harper. Your grandfather would be proud. Something about his tone struck Melody as disingenuous. The other board members exchanged glances that seemed loaded with unspoken meaning. Is someone going to explain to me exactly what just happened? Melody asked, her marketing executive voice taking over, the one she used when demanding explanations from underperforming team members. That seemed unnecessarily dramatic. Walter Simmons, the oldest board member with thinning white hair and liver-spotted hands, chuckled. My dear, what did you expect when you purchased controlling interest in the company? These transitions are rarely smooth, especially with someone like Washington. Someone like Washington? Melody repeated, her uneasiness growing. You mean a CEO defending his position? Let's just say Washington never quite understood his place, Thomas Fletcher, the CFO, interjected. Franklin had very specific ideas about company hierarchy. As the men around her nodded in agreement, Melody felt increasingly like she had stepped into a private club with rules she didn't understand. One by one, the board members excused themselves, citing various commitments, until only Richard remained with her in the luxurious cabin. I think I need some straight answers, Melody said once they were alone. Starting with why my grandfather never told me about his stake in this airline, and why everyone seemed so eager to remove James Washington. Richard's politician's smile faltered slightly. He swirled his scotch, considering his words carefully before speaking. Franklin was a traditionalist, shall we say. When he founded Skyline Airways 40 years ago, he had very clear ideas about who should occupy the executive offices. The airline industry was different then, a gentleman's club, if you will. You mean white, Melody said flatly. Richard shrugged. Franklin believed certain people were naturally suited to certain roles. When health problems forced him to step back 10 years ago, the board followed his wishes regarding succession planning. Then how did James Washington become CEO? Richard's expression darkened. A perfect storm of circumstances. An unexpectedly vocal minority of progressive board members. Pressure from diversity advocacy groups. And most significantly, Washington's undeniable talent for turning around struggling operations. He had saved our Chicago hub from collapse, and the board, against Franklin's wishes, promoted him to COO, then CEO when Peterson retired. And the company's performance under his leadership? Initially strong, Richard admitted reluctantly. Washington implemented several innovative programs. Employee satisfaction reached record highs. Our safety record became the industry's best. So why remove him? Melody pressed. If he was performing well. Recent financial challenges, Richard interrupted. Declining quarterly profits. Market share pressure from competitors. The explanation seemed reasonable on its surface, but something didn't add up. Melody had reviewed enough corporate financial statements in her career to know that short-term fluctuations didn't justify removing successful leadership. I'd like to see the complete financial records for the past 5 years, she said. Richard's smile tightened. Of course. The CFO can prepare those for you. In the meantime, there's something you should see. He reached into his briefcase and removed a leather-bound portfolio embossed with the Skyline logo. Inside were photographs of what appeared to be an exclusive resort community. Skyhaven, Richard explained. A luxury development in the Cayman Islands. Skyline owns prime oceanfront property there, currently underutilized as a crew training facility. We've had offers from developers willing to pay 3 times the assessed value. Let me guess, Melody said, Washington opposed selling. He's been unreasonably attached to maintaining company assets rather than maximizing shareholder value, Richard confirmed. With you now in control, we can move forward with this sale and several other initiatives that will significantly increase your return on investment. As Richard continued outlining various assets that could be optimized, Melody's attention was drawn to a framed photograph hanging on the jet's bulkhead. It showed a group of pilots and flight attendants from various ethnic backgrounds standing proudly in front of a Skyline aircraft. James Washington stood among them, not centered or highlighted, but clearly part of the team. That was from our diversity initiative launch, Richard said, following her gaze. Washington's pet project. Cost the company millions with minimal return. Minimal return? Melody questioned. Earlier you mentioned record employee satisfaction and safety records. Richard waved dismissively. Soft metrics that don't translate to shareholder value. Speaking of which, there's something else you should know about your grandfather. He pulled out another file, this one containing what appeared to be legal documents. Franklin was very particular about his legacy. He structured his share transfer to you with certain expectations. Should you choose to reinstate Washington or oppose the board's recommended direction, there are provisions that could significantly impact your inheritance. Melody took the document, scanning its dense legal language. Are you threatening me, Mr. Klein? Not at all, Richard replied smoothly. Simply ensuring you have all the information necessary to make informed decisions as Skyline's new leader. Your grandfather built this airline according to his vision. He would expect you to honor that. As Richard spoke, Melody noticed a newspaper that had been left on one of the seats. The business section featured an article about airline industry labor practices. A highlighted quote caught her eye: Skyline Airways' innovative profit-sharing program for all employees, from baggage handlers to executives, has revolutionized industry standards, according to CEO James Washington. The disconnect between this public reporting and Richard's characterization of Washington's leadership deepened Melody's suspicions. I think I've heard enough for today, she said, standing abruptly. I need time to process all this information before making any further decisions. Richard looked disappointed but nodded. Of course. The board has already announced an interim leadership structure, with me serving as acting CEO until permanent arrangements can be made. We'll reconvene tomorrow to discuss next steps. As Melody exited the private jet into the rainy night, she felt the weight of her impulsive decision pressing down on her. What had she done? Had she just become a pawn in some corporate game she didn't understand? Or worse, had she unwittingly become the face of the same discriminatory practices her progressive-minded friends would abhor? The rain soaked through her designer blazer as she walked toward the terminal, no longer feeling like the powerful executive who had boarded a plane to Atlanta just hours ago. Do you think Melody is beginning to see the truth about the board's intentions? Comment number 1 if you believe she'll continue to go along with Richard's plans, or comment number 2 if you think she'll investigate further and question the board's motives. Will she discover her grandfather's true legacy and the real reason behind James Washington's removal? Like and subscribe to find out what secrets are hidden in Skyline Airways' past and how they'll shape its future. The Skyline Airways corporate apartment in downtown Charlotte felt coldly impersonal to Melody as she paced across its polished hardwood floors. Rain continued to lash against floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city's skyline, now obscured by storm clouds and darkness. After leaving the private jet, she had been whisked to this luxury accommodation by Richard's assistant, who had explained that the apartment was kept for visiting executives. Melody couldn't help but notice that despite the expensive furniture and state-of-the-art amenities, there was something sterile about the space, as if it had been designed to impress rather than welcome. Just like the performance she had witnessed on the corporate jet, she thought. Her phone buzzed with an incoming text from Richard: dinner with key investors tomorrow, 7 p.m. Formal attire. Car will collect you at 6:30. Not a request, she noted. An instruction. Melody tossed her phone onto the sofa and walked to the wet bar, pouring herself a generous glass of bourbon. The events of the day swirled in her mind like the amber liquid in her glass. What had started as a routine business trip had transformed into something unrecognizable, a corporate takeover she had initiated without understanding the stakes or players involved. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Cautiously, she approached the door and checked the peephole. A young woman in a Skyline Airways uniform stood in the hallway, clutching a portfolio. Yes. Melody called through the door. Ms. Harper. I'm Rachel, from Mr. Washington's office. I have the files you requested. Melody hadn't requested any files. Curiosity piqued, she opened the door. Rachel appeared to be in her late 20s, with natural hair pulled back in a professional bun and intelligent eyes that assessed Melody carefully. Mr. Klein said you wanted these financial records, Rachel explained, offering the portfolio. I worked, as Mr. Washington's executive assistant. The slight correction in tense spoke volumes. Please, come in, Melody said, stepping aside. Rachel hesitated visibly. I should get back. Things are rather chaotic at headquarters with the transition. Just for a moment, Melody insisted. I have some questions about these documents. Reluctantly, Rachel entered the apartment, maintaining a professional distance as Melody closed the door. "You said you were James Washington's assistant?" Melody asked, gesturing for Rachel to sit. "For 3 years," Rachel confirmed, perching on the edge of a chair. "Since he promoted me from the customer service department." "He promoted you directly to executive assistant?" Rachel's posture stiffened slightly. "Mr. Washington has a policy of identifying talent throughout the organization, regardless of position. He started the employee advancement program specifically to create pathways for frontline workers to move into management." The pride in Rachel's voice was unmistakable. "Tell me about him," Melody said, sitting across from Rachel. "As a leader." Rachel studied Melody's face, clearly trying to determine her motives. "Mr. Washington is the most respected CEO in Skyline's history," she finally said. "He works longer hours than anyone. Knows the names of maintenance crew members in every hub. Created profit sharing that includes everyone from baggage handlers to pilots." "That doesn't sound like someone running a company into financial trouble," Melody observed. Rachel's expression remained carefully neutral. "I'm not at liberty to discuss the company's financial status. Even though I'm now the majority shareholder." A flash of something, anger, fear, crossed Rachel's features before her professional mask returned. "Especially because of that, Ms. Harper." Melody set down her glass and leaned forward. "Rachel, I think we both know something isn't right about what happened today. I made a rash decision based on incomplete information, and now a man has lost his job, possibly his career. I need to understand what's really going on." Rachel remained silent, her internal conflict visible in her rigid posture. "Please," Melody added softly. "Help me understand what I've done." After a long moment, Rachel reached for the portfolio she had brought. "These aren't the files Mr. Klein thinks I delivered," she said quietly, opening the portfolio to reveal a different set of documents. "These are copies of records Mr. Washington kept separately, records that contradict the financial narrative the board has been pushing." Melody accepted the files, scanning quickly through the first pages. They showed Skyline's financial performance over the past 5 years, with annotations highlighting specific decision points and their impacts. "According to these, the company has been consistently profitable under James's leadership," Melody noted, confusion evident in her voice. "Until 8 months ago," Rachel confirmed. "When several seemingly random events began affecting our bottom line." She pulled out specific reports, laying them on the coffee table between them. "A fuel supplier suddenly raised rates for our major hubs but not for our competitors. Key maintenance contracts were unexpectedly cancelled. Regulatory approvals for new routes were mysteriously delayed." "That sounds like more than bad luck," Melody said. "Mr. Washington thought so too. He began investigating privately, keeping records separate from the company's main systems." Rachel hesitated before continuing. 3 weeks ago, he discovered something troubling. Board member Richard Klein has been meeting with executives from National Airways, our largest competitor." "You're suggesting corporate sabotage?" Melody asked incredulously. "I'm not suggesting anything," Rachel replied carefully. "I'm simply sharing information Mr. Washington documented." She pulled out another file, this one containing photographs. They showed Richard Klein entering a private dining club with a man Melody didn't recognize. "That's Victor Harmon, CEO of National Airways," Rachel explained. "These meetings weren't on Mr. Klein's official calendar." As Melody processed this information, Rachel pulled out one final document, older than the others, with a faded Skyline Airways letterhead from 20 years earlier. "This is what Mr. Washington found in the archived board minutes," she said quietly. "It may explain why certain board members were so eager to remove him." Melody began reading the document, her stomach tightening with each paragraph. It detailed a board meeting from 1998, when her grandfather was still actively running the company. The minutes recorded Franklin Harper's vehement opposition to affirmative action hiring practices, and his insistence that certain positions within the company structure remain reserved for individuals with the appropriate background and cultural understanding. The document went on to outline a gentleman's agreement among the board members that executive leadership would remain consistent with the company's founding principles. My grandfather was explicitly preventing black employees from reaching executive positions, Melody said, the words bitter in her mouth. Yes, Rachel confirmed simply. Mr. Washington was the first to break that ceiling at Skyline. Many believe it's why Mr. Harper sold his shares in competing airlines before his death. He never accepted Mr. Washington's leadership, despite the company's success. Melody stood abruptly, pacing to the window. The rain had intensified, sheets of water cascading down the glass, distorting the city lights beyond. So my grandfather was a racist who couldn't stand that a black man was successfully running his airline, she summarized bluntly. And now I've helped the old guard remove that man from power. You didn't know, Rachel offered quietly. I should have asked questions before acting, Melody countered. Instead, I let wounded pride and the opportunity for petty revenge guide my decisions. She turned back to Rachel. There's more, isn't there? About the company's future? Rachel nodded. National Airways has made 3 offers to buy Skyline in the past year. Each time, Mr. Washington convinced the board to reject the offer. National's business model involves aggressive cost-cutting, which typically means significant layoffs. How significant? Based on their previous acquisitions, approximately 40% of Skyline's 17,000 employees would lose their jobs. Primarily frontline workers, customer service representatives, and maintenance personnel. The human cost of what she had inadvertently set in motion hit Melody like a physical blow. Thousands of families affected because of her impulsive decision. What was Richard Klein's position on the buyout offers, she asked, though she suspected the answer. He advocated accepting each one, Rachel confirmed. The board was deadlocked until your shares came into play. Melody's mind raced, connecting the dots. So Richard manipulated me into removing James because with James gone, there would be no opposition to selling the airline to National. And as majority shareholder, you would receive the largest payout, Rachel added. While thousands lose their livelihoods. Silence fell between them as Melody absorbed the full implications of her actions. Finally, she spoke. Does James know about all of this evidence? Yes. He was building a case to present to the full board and shareholders. He just needed more time. Time I took away from him, Melody said, guilt washing over her. Rachel stood, gathering the documents and returning them to the portfolio. What will you do now, Ms. Harper? She asked, her tone carefully neutral but her eyes searching Melody's face. It was the question Melody had been asking herself since watching James being escorted from his own aircraft. Now, with this new information, the path forward seemed both clear and daunting. First, I need to understand exactly what my grandfather did, she said firmly. The full extent of his discriminatory practices and how they shaped the company. Then I need to figure out how to fix the damage I've done. Rachel nodded, a hint of hope crossing her features. Mr. Washington kept detailed records in his home office. All the evidence about the board's activities, your grandfather's history with the company, everything. Would he speak with me? Melody asked. After what I did today? I don't know, Rachel admitted. But I can give you his address. As Rachel wrote down the information, Melody felt a newfound determination replacing her earlier confusion and guilt. She had been manipulated into becoming the face of her grandfather's lingering prejudice. Now she had a chance to choose a different path, to right a wrong she had unwittingly perpetuated. Thank you, Rachel, she said as she accepted the slip of paper. For taking this risk. Rachel met her gaze directly for the first time. I didn't do it for you, Ms. Harper. I did it for the 17,000 people who call Skyline Airways their professional home. The family Mr. Washington built despite your grandfather's best efforts to exclude people who look like me. With those words, Rachel left, leaving Melody alone with uncomfortable truths and the weight of decisions to come. The rain had finally stopped by morning, leaving Charlotte's streets glistening under a hesitant sun. Melody, dressed in jeans and a simple blouse rather than her usual designer workwear, sat in a corner booth at an airport hotel coffee shop. Across from her, Zoe Reynolds, the flight attendant from yesterday's fateful flight, fidgeted nervously with her coffee cup. "I really shouldn't be talking to you," Zoe said, glancing around as if expecting to see airline management watching them. "Especially not after what happened with Mr. Washington." "I understand your concern," Melody replied, keeping her voice low. "But I need to hear the truth about Skyline from the people who work there, not just the board members." After a sleepless night reviewing the documents Rachel had provided, Melody had made her first move, contacting the flight attendant who had been so quick to side with her during the seating dispute. Finding Zoe had been surprisingly easy, a social media search and a direct message explaining that she wanted to apologize for the incident had secured this morning meeting. "What do you want to know?" Zoe asked cautiously. "Tell me about James Washington as a leader. The real story, not the official version." Zoe's expression softened slightly. "Mr. Washington is different from previous executives. When he became CEO, he started by working alongside every department for a week each, even spent time loading baggage and cleaning aircraft to understand what we all deal with. That's unusual for a CEO," Melody noted. "It changed everything," Zoe confirmed, warming to the subject. "He implemented paid family leave when his own assistant had a baby. Created emergency funds for employees facing hardship. Started profit sharing that included everyone, not just executives. And how has that affected the company's performance? Employee turnover dropped by 60%. Our customer satisfaction scores are the highest in the industry. We've won safety awards 3 years running." Zoe leaned forward, her initial wariness giving way to pride. "People actually want to work for Skyline now. I turned down offers from 2 other airlines with better base pay because our culture and profit sharing make up the difference." Melody nodded, mentally comparing this account with the declining performance narrative Richard had presented. "What about his management style? Any complaints?" Zoe hesitated. "He's demanding. Expects excellence. But he's also fair, promotes based on performance, not politics or..." She trailed off. "Not race?" Melody suggested gently. Zoe looked uncomfortable. There were always rumors about the old guard, how certain positions weren't available to certain people. Mr. Washington changed that. "Our executive team is the most diverse in the industry now." "And how was that received by longtime employees?" "Honestly, there was resistance. Some managers who'd been around since your grandfather's time couldn't adjust to reporting to people they wouldn't have even hired before. Most left. The ones who stayed learned to adapt." Melody absorbed this information, adding it to her growing understanding of James Washington's impact on the company culture. "One more question," she said. "Yesterday on the plane, when I claimed James was in my seat, why did you immediately side with me without checking his boarding pass?" Zoe's cheeks flushed with shame. "I've been asking myself the same question. It was automatic, something I never thought I'd do. I've been through all the diversity training, consider myself progressive, but in that moment..." She shook her head. "I made an assumption based on how you both looked. I'm not proud of it." The honest self-reflection reminded Melody of her own awakening to unconscious bias. She thanked Zoe for her candor and left the coffee shop with another piece of the puzzle in place. Her next stop was Skyline's Charlotte headquarters, a gleaming glass building near the airport. Using her status as majority shareholder, she gained access without Richard Klein's knowledge. She introduced herself as conducting a leadership transition assessment and spent the morning observing and quietly speaking with employees from various departments. What she discovered aligned perfectly with Zoe's account. Pictures of James with employees lined the walls. Meeting rooms were named after diverse aviation pioneers. A large monitor in the lobby displayed real-time profit-sharing calculations, showing exactly how the company's performance translated to employee bonuses. In the employee cafeteria, Melody noticed something striking. Unlike the segregated lunchrooms of her grandfather's era that had so disturbed her as a child, Skyline's dining area showed pilots sitting alongside maintenance workers, executives sharing tables with customer service representatives. The hierarchical barriers so common in corporate America seemed notably absent. As she left the building, Melody made one final stop, the Human Resources Department, where she requested records of leadership diversity over time. The data told a compelling story. Before James Washington became CEO, less than 10% of management positions were held by people of color. Now, the leadership team reflected the diversity of the communities Skyline served. With each discovery, the contrast between the company James had built and the one her grandfather had envisioned grew starker. By afternoon, Melody had made her decision. She would visit James Washington's home as Rachel had suggested, but first, she needed to understand more about her own family's role in Skyline's history. She directed her rental car toward the public library, where newspaper archives might provide insight into Franklin Harper's business practices. Hours later, surrounded by microfiche printouts and historical business journals, Melody stared at headlines that painted a disturbing picture. Harper Airlines faces discrimination lawsuit, 1975. Skyline Airways settles EEOC complaint, 1982. Minority pilots claim systematic exclusion at major carriers, 1990. Her grandfather's airline, now her airline, had repeatedly faced accusations of discriminatory hiring and promotion practices. In each case, the company had settled without admission of wrongdoing, but the pattern was unmistakable. Most disturbing was an interview Franklin had given to a business magazine in 1988, where he openly stated, "Some positions require individuals who understand our core clientele. It's not discrimination, it's good business to have leadership that reflects our primary customer base." As Melody drove through Charlotte's upscale Myers Park neighborhood toward the address Rachel had provided for James Washington, her mind was made up. She had been manipulated into becoming a tool for perpetuating her grandfather's discriminatory legacy. Now she would find a way to make amends. James Washington's home was not what she expected. Rather than the ostentatious mansion a CEO might typically occupy, his residence was a tasteful tutor in a diverse, family-oriented neighborhood. Children played on front lawns as Melody parked across the street, gathering her courage for the confrontation ahead. The man who answered her knock was a far cry from the composed executive she had encountered on the plane. James Washington appeared tired, his tailored suit replaced by jeans and a Howard University sweatshirt. Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed quickly by wariness. "Ms. Harper," he said flatly. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I need to speak with you," Melody replied. "About Skyline, my grandfather, and the mistake I made yesterday." James regarded her silently for a long moment before stepping back from the door. "You'd better come in," he said. "Though I'm not sure what we have to discuss." The interior of James's home reflected its owner, unpretentious yet dignified, with family photos lining the hallway and books filling built-in shelves. He led her to a home office where folders and documents were spread across a desk. "Cleaning out my files," he explained, his tone deliberately neutral. 20 years at Skyline generates a lot of paperwork. "That's why I'm here," Melody said, remaining standing though James had gestured toward a chair. "I've spent the day learning about the company, the real company, not the version Richard Klein presented to me." James crossed his arms. "And what have you discovered that brings the new majority shareholder to my home?" "That I was manipulated into helping remove the best CEO Skyline has ever had," Melody replied directly. "That my grandfather was a racist who structured his company to exclude people like you from leadership. And that Richard Klein is orchestrating a sale to National Airways that would destroy everything you've built." If James was surprised by her bluntness, he didn't show it. "You learned all that in one day." "Rachel brought me your files," Melody admitted. "I spoke with employees. I researched my grandfather's history with the company. For the first time, James's composed exterior cracked slightly. Rachel risked her job. She believed it was worth the risk. For the 17,000 people whose livelihoods are at stake. James studied her face, searching for sincerity or deception. Whatever he saw prompted him to finally sit, gesturing again for Melody to do the same. "Why are you really here, Miss Harper?" he asked. "To ease your conscience. To offer some token position that preserves your newfound wealth while appearing progressive?" The accusation stung, but Melody recognized she had earned his suspicion. "I'm here because I made a terrible mistake," she said simply. "I let wounded pride and the opportunity for petty revenge guide a decision that affects thousands of lives. I didn't ask questions when I should have. I didn't consider consequences beyond my immediate satisfaction." She met his gaze directly. "I'm here because I want to fix what I broke. If that's still possible." James leaned back in his chair, his expression guarded but thoughtful. "Do you know what I did before joining Skyline?" he asked unexpectedly. Melody shook her head. "I was a lawyer specializing in employment discrimination cases," he said. "I represented people who faced the exact barriers your grandfather built into his company." He gestured toward a framed photograph on his desk, a much younger James standing beside an elderly black man in a custodial uniform. "That's my father, William Washington. He spent 40 years cleaning offices at Newark Airport, watching planes take off, piloted by men who wouldn't acknowledge his existence. He worked extra shifts to put me through college, then law school." James's voice remained steady, but emotion flickered behind his eyes. "When Skyline hired me as legal counsel 20 years ago, your grandfather was still chairman. He made his disapproval clear in ways both subtle and overt. When I became chief operating officer despite his objections, he sold his shares in competing airlines as a protest." "But you stayed," Melody observed. "Why?" "Because systems don't change from the outside," James replied simply. "I could file lawsuits for decades without creating lasting change. Or I could work my way into a position where I could dismantle discriminatory structures from within." He stood and walked to a bookshelf, pulling out a leather-bound volume. "This is Skyline's original employee manual from 1970, he said, handing it to Melody. "Page 42 has the executive qualifications section." Melody opened to the indicated page and read the requirements for senior leadership. "Candidates must present the appropriate executive presence and cultural understanding to represent Skyline Airways to its primary clientele and business partners. Corporate speak for whites only," James explained. Never explicitly stated, but consistently enforced. That manual was still in use when I joined the company. He took the book back, replacing it with a modern employee handbook. "This is Skyline today. Leadership qualifications based on performance metrics, innovation, and demonstrated ability to manage diverse teams effectively. Profit sharing for everyone from baggage handlers to executives. Promotion pathways that identify talent regardless of background." The contrast between her grandfather's company and the one James had built could not have been clearer. "Richard plans to sell to National next week," Melody said quietly. "Using my shares to push through the deal." James nodded. "I expected as much. National will dismantle everything we've built. Their business model depends on minimizing labor costs, which means eliminating the profit sharing, the educational support programs, the career advancement initiatives. And thousands of jobs," Melody added. "Yes. Particularly in communities that can least afford the losses." The weight of responsibility settled firmly on Melody's shoulders. Her impulsive action had jeopardized not just one man's career but an entire corporate culture that was actively addressing the very inequities her grandfather had perpetuated. "What can we do?" she asked simply. James studied her for a long moment, weighing her sincerity against his understandable mistrust. He finally responded, a hint of surprise in his voice. "If you're willing," Melody said. "I have the shares, but you have the knowledge and the trust of the employees. Together, We might have a chance to stop Richard and save what you've built." For the first time since their confrontation began, James Washington smiled, a small, cautious expression, but genuine. "Ms. Harper," he said, "I believe we have work to do." Morning sunlight streamed through the windows of James Washington's home office, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and the exhausted but determined faces of the unlikely allies who had worked through the night. Coffee cups and takeout containers littered the large oak table where Melody Harper and James Washington sat, surrounded by documents, legal pads filled with notes, and a whiteboard covered with strategy points. "Richard will expect me at the investor dinner tonight," Melody said, rubbing her tired eyes. "He'll be suspicious if I cancel." "Then you should go," James replied, his voice hoarse from hours of talking. "Maintain the illusion that you're still following his lead while we gather more allies." The tension that had marked their initial confrontation had gradually evolved into a wary professional respect as they worked through the night, piecing together Richard Klein's scheme and developing a counter-strategy. Their shared goal, saving Skyline Airways from being dismantled, had created a tentative bridge across the chasm of mistrust. "We need more than just the two of us," Melody observed, scanning the list of board members they had categorized as either loyal to Richard, potential allies, or unknown. "I've been making calls while you reviewed those financial projections," James said. "Marcus Chen, our Chief Technology Officer, is on board. So is Desiree Williams, VP of Operations. Both were promoted under my leadership and have no love for the old guard." "What about legal support?" Melody asked. "Richard will have the company's general counsel in his pocket." James smiled for the first time that morning. "I may have been a CEO for 7 years, but I was Skyline's lead counsel for 10 years before that. I still have connections at Gibson and Mitchell, they'll represent us independently if needed." Melody nodded, impressed by his foresight. Despite being blindsided by yesterday's takeover, James had already activated a support network while maintaining his professional composure. It was exactly the kind of leadership that Richard had tried to convince her was lacking. "We still have one major problem," she said, pointing to the whiteboard where they had outlined the ownership structure. "Even with my 51% and support from sympathetic board members, Richard has clearly been planning this for months. He'll have legal maneuvers prepared that we haven't anticipated." James considered this, then reached for his phone. "There's someone else we should bring in. Someone who knows Richard's playbook because she helped write it before having a change of heart." 20 minutes later, a silver Lexus pulled into James's driveway. The woman who emerged carried herself with the confident precision of someone accustomed to navigating corporate battlefields. Her tailored pantsuit and steel-gray bob projected authority, but the warm smile she offered James as he opened the door revealed a deeper connection. "James Washington," she said, embracing him briefly. "When you call at 6 a.m. saying it's an emergency, how could I refuse?" "Melody, this is Patricia Klein," James introduced as they entered the office. Former board member of Skyline Airways and Richard's ex-wife. Melody's surprise must have been evident on her face. "Yes, that Richard," Patricia confirmed with a wry smile. "I served on Skyline's board for 12 years before our divorce prompted my retirement. Patricia was one of my strongest advocates when I was being considered for CEO," James explained. "Richard never forgave her for voting against his preferred candidate." Among other irreconcilable differences, Patricia added dryly, accepting the coffee James offered. She surveyed the strategy-covered whiteboard with practiced efficiency. "I see you've identified the problem. National Airways acquisition, Richard orchestrating from the shadows, and you," she nodded toward Melody, inadvertently providing the shareholder leverage he needed. "That's an accurate summary," Melody admitted, slightly unnerved by the older woman's directness. "Good," Patricia said briskly. "I appreciate people who acknowledge their mistakes. Now, let's discuss how to correct them." Over the next hour, Patricia's insider knowledge proved invaluable. She identified weaknesses in Richard's likely strategy, pointed out allies they had overlooked, and suggested legal approaches that might neutralize his advantage. "Richard always follows the same pattern," she explained, circling a date on their timeline. He'll call for a vote when he thinks you're most vulnerable. In this case, probably at the emergency shareholder meeting he's scheduled for Monday. 3 days from now, James noted grimly. Which means we need to be ready before then, Patricia confirmed. He'll have proxies lined up, procedural motions prepared, and almost certainly some embarrassing revelation about James designed to undermine any last-minute resistance. What kind of revelation? Melody asked. Patricia and James exchanged a look that suggested a shared history. 5 years ago, I implemented a scholarship program for employees' children, James explained. One of the first recipients was my niece. Richard claimed it was nepotism, though the selection committee made their decision without knowing the relationship. The board investigated and found no wrongdoing, Patricia added. But Richard never let it go. He'll twist it into something sinister given the opportunity. As they refined their strategy, Melody found herself increasingly impressed by James's composure and strategic thinking. Despite having his life's work threatened, he maintained focus on protecting employees rather than his personal position. The most important thing is stopping the sale to National, he emphasized repeatedly. Whether or not I return as CEO is secondary to preserving what we've built for our people. By midday, their alliance had expanded to include a conference call with Marcus Chen and Desiree Williams, both of whom provided additional insights and pledged their support. James's former executive assistant Rachel joined them with USB drives containing backup copies of critical documents. Richard's team has already restricted access to these files in the company system, Rachel reported. They're moving fast. As evening approached, Melody reluctantly prepared to leave for the investor dinner Richard had arranged. Before departing, she paused in James's doorway. I need to ask you something, she said quietly. Something personal. James looked up from his laptop, his expression guarded but attentive. After everything my grandfather did to prevent someone like you from leading his company, Melody continued, after the systems of exclusion he built, why didn't you dismantle Skyline out of spite once you had the power? Why preserve anything he created? James considered the question carefully before responding. Because the company isn't defined by its founders' prejudices, he finally said. Skyline is 17,000 people who deserve better than to be punished for Franklin Harper's failings. It's pilots who take pride in their safety record, flight attendants who go above and beyond for passengers, mechanics who work through the night to keep planes in the air. He stood, walking to the window that overlooked the neighborhood where children were now playing in evening twilight. Dismantling systems of inequality isn't about revenge, he continued. It's about building something better in their place. Something that works for everyone, not just those who've traditionally held power. The simplicity and wisdom of his answer made Melody feel small in comparison. Here was a man who had faced barriers her privilege had protected her from ever experiencing, yet he had chosen construction over destruction, improvement over vengeance. I'll see you back here after the dinner, she said, a new determination in her voice. We have a company to save. 2 hours later, Melody sat in an exclusive Charlotte restaurant, surrounded by wealthy investors whom Richard Klein was courting to support the National Airways acquisition. She played her role perfectly, the naive heiress dazzled by potential returns on investment, asking just enough questions to seem engaged without revealing her newfound understanding of what was really at stake. Richard was in his element, charming the assembled financiers with promises of streamlined operations and optimized assets, corporate euphemisms for the job cuts and service reductions that would follow any deal with National. And our majority shareholder, the lovely Ms. Harper, has been instrumental in facilitating this exciting new chapter, Richard announced, raising a glass in her direction. Franklin would be proud to see his granddaughter taking such an active role in securing Skyline's future. Melody returned his toast with a practiced smile, even as her stomach churned at the thought of her grandfather's approval being used as currency in this transaction. The Franklin Harper she had discovered through her investigation was not someone whose pride she coveted. As the evening progressed, Melody excused herself to visit the restroom, using the moment of privacy to send a text to James, Richard confirming deal with National scheduled for board vote Monday. mentioned significant personnel restructuring as key to projected profits. James's response came quickly. Patricia made contact with 3 institutional investors who control 12% collectively. They're reviewing our alternative proposal now. The pieces of their counter-strategy were falling into place. By the time Melody returned to the dinner table, her determination had hardened into resolve. Richard Klein had manipulated her into becoming an instrument of exclusion and inequality. Now she would use her unexpected inheritance to honor not her grandfather's prejudice, but James Washington's vision of opportunity and inclusion. As Richard droned on about shareholder value, Melody studied the faces around the table, wealthy, predominantly white men discussing the fate of thousands of diverse employees whose livelihoods hung in the balance. The contrast between this scene and the vibrant, inclusive workspace she had observed at Skyline's headquarters could not have been starker. In that moment, Melody Harper made a decision that would define not just Skyline's future, but her own. She would not be Franklin Harper's legacy. She would write her own. The Skyline Airways corporate headquarters buzzed with tension as shareholders, board members, and executives filed into the main conference room for the emergency meeting Richard Klein had called. Security personnel stood at strategic points throughout the building, a precaution Richard had insisted upon, given the sensitive nature of today's agenda. Melody Harper sat alone at one end of the polished conference table, dressed in a navy blue suit that projected confidence she didn't entirely feel. 3 days of intensive preparation had led to this moment, but Richard's resources and decades of corporate maneuvering experience still made him a formidable opponent. Across the room, Richard conferred with a group of board members, occasionally glancing in Melody's direction with the satisfied smile of someone who believed victory was assured. He had spent the weekend courting shareholders and allies, unaware that Melody was no longer the malleable pawn he had manipulated days earlier. As the room filled, Melody noted familiar faces from her investigation. Zoe Reynolds had taken a seat in the observer section, along with several other Skyline employees who had responded to discreet invitations from James's team. Their presence reminded her of the human stakes behind today's procedural battle. At precisely 9 a.m., Richard called the meeting to order. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending this emergency session," he began, his politician's voice carrying effortlessly through the room. "As you know, Skyline Airways stands at a crucial juncture. Today we will vote on a proposed acquisition by National Airways that would provide significant returns to shareholders while securing the company's future in an increasingly competitive market." He gestured toward a team of suited executives seated near the door. "Representatives from National are here to answer any final questions before we proceed to a vote on their generous offer." Richard's strategy was clear: move quickly to a vote while he believed he had the numbers locked in. Melody had anticipated this and was prepared. "Point of order," she said clearly, rising from her seat. "As majority shareholder, I request that discussion of any acquisition proposal be tabled until we address the irregular removal of CEO James Washington, which occurred without proper board procedure." Richard's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Ms. Harper, if I recall correctly, you were present for and supportive of the leadership transition on Thursday." "I was present but acting on incomplete and misleading information," Melody replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I've since conducted a thorough review of company performance under Mr. Washington's leadership and found significant discrepancies between the narrative presented to me and the documented reality." Murmurs rippled through the assembled shareholders as Richard attempted to regain control of the meeting. "This is hardly the time to revisit settled matters," he said dismissively. "We have distinguished guests waiting to—" Actually, Patricia Klein interrupted from her seat near the back. "Corporate bylaws clearly state that any action regarding executive leadership must be ratified at the next full board meeting. That would be today." Richard's face darkened at his ex-wife's unexpected intervention. "Patricia, you're no longer a board member. You have no standing in this meeting." "I'm here as proxy for the Turner Family Trust," Patricia replied smoothly, holding up a notarized document. "Which controls 2% of outstanding shares. And the bylaws are quite clear on this point." Before Richard could respond, the conference room door opened, and James Washington entered, flanked by Marcus Chen and Desiree Williams. A collective gasp rose from those who had witnessed his removal days earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen," James said, his deep voice commanding immediate attention, "I apologize for the disruption, but given that my status as CEO remains officially unresolved according to corporate bylaws, I believe I have the right to address this gathering before any vote occurs." Richard's composure slipped momentarily as he realized the coordinated nature of what was unfolding. "This is highly irregular," he protested, looking to the company's general counsel for support. The lawyer, clearly uncomfortable, consulted the bylaws before reluctantly confirming, "Mr. Washington is technically correct. Without ratification by the full board, his removal remains provisional." With that procedural victory secured, James took a position at the opposite end of the conference table from Richard. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present, two visions for Skyline Airways facing off across a polished expanse of mahogany. "Before this body votes on selling Skyline Airways to National," James began, "you deserve to know several facts that have been deliberately withheld from shareholders." He nodded to Marcus Chen, who distributed folders to each board member and major shareholder. "These documents show Skyline's actual financial performance over the past 5 years, compared with the selectively edited reports Mr. Klein has been providing to the board." As the recipients examined the contents, James continued, "You'll note that despite Mr. Klein's claims of declining performance, Skyline has outperformed industry averages in profitability, safety ratings, and customer satisfaction for 20 consecutive quarters under my leadership." Richard attempted to interject, but James pressed on. "You'll also find documented evidence that several random business setbacks over the past 8 months were in fact coordinated efforts to artificially depress company performance and share price." This revelation caused an even louder stir among the shareholders, many of whom were seeing the full financial picture for the first time. "This is absurd," Richard finally managed to break in. "These are desperate fabrications from a disgruntled former executive." "Are they?" Melody asked, rising to stand beside James. "Or are they consistent with your documented meetings with National Airways executives dating back 18 months? Meetings that weren't disclosed to the board despite clear conflict of interest policies?" She nodded to Rachel, who displayed email correspondence between Richard and National on the room's large screen, correspondence that had been recovered from backup servers during their weekend investigation. "Ms. Harper," Richard said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low tone, "I would caution you to consider your position carefully. Your grandfather's legacy is precisely what I'm considering," Melody interrupted. "Franklin Harper's legacy includes decades of discriminatory practices that Mr. Washington has spent years dismantling and replacing with systems of opportunity and inclusion." She turned to address the entire room, no longer the uncertain heiress who had stumbled into corporate power days earlier. "My grandfather built this airline according to his limited vision of who deserved opportunity. James Washington rebuilt it into something better, a company that succeeds financially while providing pathways to advancement for all employees, regardless of background." Richard's expression hardened. "This is all very touching, but sentiment doesn't change the fact that National's offer represents maximum shareholder value, which is the board's fiduciary duty." "Short-term value," James corrected. "At the cost of thousands of jobs and the corporate culture that has made Skyline an industry leader." He turned to the National Airways representatives. "Your acquisition model depends on eliminating our profit-sharing program, reducing our workforce by approximately 40%, and cutting the employee advancement initiatives that have given us the lowest turnover rate in the industry. Is that correct?" The national executives shifted uncomfortably but didn't deny the assertion. Sensing momentum shifting, Melody played her final card. "As majority shareholder, I propose an alternative," she announced. "Instead of selling to National, I move that we establish an employee ownership program, transferring 20% of my shares to a trust benefiting all Skyline employees." Gasps and murmurs swept through the room at this unexpected proposal. Such a structure would preserve jobs, maintain our industry-leading practices, and still provide substantial returns to shareholders through the company's continued growth, Melody continued. The trust would ensure employees have meaningful input in corporate governance while maintaining stable leadership under Mr. Washington, whose reinstatement as CEO I also formally propose. Richard's face had turned an alarming shade of red. This is outrageous. Franklin Harper would never have allowed. Franklin Harper is dead, Melody said flatly. And his granddaughter gets to decide how his shares will be used. She turned to face the assembled shareholders directly. Each of you has a choice today. You can vote for National's offer, which promises a one-time payout followed by thousands of layoffs and the dismantling of a successful company culture. Or you can support a vision that balances profit with people, creating sustainable value and preserving what makes Skyline unique in the industry. As shareholders began discussing among themselves, Richard made one final, desperate attempt to regain control. Before anyone votes on these ill-conceived proposals, he said, voice tight with barely controlled anger, you should know that Ms. Harper's sudden conversion to corporate crusader comes with its own questionable motivations. He gestured to an assistant, who distributed a different set of documents. These records show that Franklin Harper was involved in multiple discrimination lawsuits during his tenure. Lawsuits that were settled with Ms. Harper's trust fund money after his death. Richard fixed Melody with a triumphant look. She's not acting from principle, she's attempting to whitewash her family's reputation by appearing progressive. Meanwhile, James Washington has his own history of questionable decisions, including funneling company resources to pet projects that benefit his family members. The scholarship program accusation, exactly as Patricia had predicted. Melody had been prepared for this moment. You're referring to the Employee Family Scholarship Program, she said calmly. A program that has sent over 300 children of Skyline employees to college, including Mr. Washington's niece, who was selected by an independent committee that didn't know her relationship to the CEO. A fact confirmed by a full board investigation at the time. She faced the shareholders directly. As for my family's history, I'm not hiding from it. My grandfather's discriminatory practices were wrong. The settlements from those lawsuits represent harm done to real people because of policies he implemented. I can't change that history, but I can acknowledge it and work to ensure it never repeats. A murmur of approval rippled through the employee section. Even some board members nodded appreciatively at her candor. Richard's smug expression faltered as his attack failed to land as expected. Before he could regroup, James stepped forward. Ladies and gentlemen, I've dedicated 20 years of my life to Skyline Airways, first as legal counsel, then as COO, and finally as CEO. I've watched this company transform from a regional carrier with a troubled culture to an industry leader in both performance and workplace equity. His voice, strong and measured, carried throughout the room without needing to rise. Today isn't about me or my position. It's about 17,000 employees whose livelihoods depend on the decision you make. It's about whether Skyline remains a company that values both profit and people, or becomes another casualty of short-term financial engineering. The room had fallen completely silent, all eyes on James as he continued. I built my career fighting discrimination in corporate America. When I joined Skyline, many thought I was betraying that mission by working for a company with Franklin Harper's reputation. But I believed then, as I believe now, that changing systems from within creates more lasting impact than attacking them from outside. James gestured toward the employees watching from the back of the room. Every person in this building deserves to work for a company that values their contribution regardless of their background. The choice before you today is whether to preserve that vision or dismantle it for a one-time profit. As James finished speaking, Patricia stood and addressed the chair. I move that we proceed to a vote on Ms. Harper's proposals, first, the reinstatement of James Washington as CEO, and second, the establishment of an employee ownership program in lieu of acquisition by National Airways. Richard, recognizing that momentum had shifted decisively against him, attempted one last procedural maneuver. Such significant proposals require further study by. Point of order, Melody interrupted. As majority shareholder, I can call for an immediate vote on these matters. I so call. The company's secretary, after consulting with the general counsel, nodded reluctantly. The majority shareholder has the right to call for a vote. We will proceed with balloting on the two proposals. The next 30 minutes passed in tense silence as votes were cast and counted. Melody watched Richard's face gradually transition from confidence to concern to barely concealed fury as the tallies became clear. Finally, the secretary stood to announce the results. On the matter of reinstating James Washington as Chief Executive Officer, 76% in favor, 24% opposed. The motion carries. A burst of applause erupted from the employee section, quickly spreading to include many shareholders and board members. On the matter of establishing an employee ownership program and rejecting the acquisition offer from National Airways, 68% in favor, 32% opposed. The motion carries. The National Airways representatives gathered their materials and departed without comment, their planned acquisition now decisively rejected. Richard Klein remained seated, his face ashen, as security personnel, the same team he had arranged to remove James days earlier, approached him. Mr. Klein, the head of security said quietly, in light of the documented evidence of your undisclosed meetings with a competitor and attempts to artificially depress company performance, the board has requested that you leave the premises immediately while an investigation is conducted. As Richard was escorted from the room, James approached Melody, extending his hand. "Thank you," he said simply. Melody shook his hand, conscious of the historical weight of the moment, a black CEO reinstated and a white majority shareholder acknowledging past wrongs while committing to a more equitable future. "This is just the beginning," she replied. "We have a lot of work ahead to implement these changes properly." James nodded, a genuine smile breaking through his professional demeanor for the first time since their confrontation. "Indeed we do. But for the first time, I believe Skyline Airways truly belongs to all the people who make it fly." Around them, employees and board members alike broke into spontaneous applause, not just for the procedural victory they had witnessed, but for the transformation it represented. A company built on exclusion had been reclaimed as a model of inclusion, its future now shared among those who contributed to its success regardless of their background. As Melody watched James being congratulated by his colleagues and employees, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had nearly become an unwitting instrument of her grandfather's lingering prejudice. Instead, she had found a way to redirect his legacy toward healing and progress. The real work was just beginning. 6 months after the dramatic boardroom showdown, Melody Harper stood in the cavernous hangar of Skyline Airways' Atlanta maintenance facility. Morning sunlight streamed through the massive doors, illuminating a freshly painted aircraft bearing the company's redesigned livery, the traditional Horizon with Wings logo now encircled by a diverse array of human figures, representing the company's new employee ownership structure. "What do you think?" James Washington asked, approaching from behind as Melody studied the aircraft. "It's perfect," she replied. "Visual representation of what we've built together." In the half year since Richard Klein's ousting and James's reinstatement as CEO, Skyline Airways had undergone a remarkable transformation. The employee ownership program had transferred 20% of Melody's shares to a trust benefiting all 17,000 employees. Quarterly profit sharing had been expanded, and a new board structure ensured frontline workers had representation in major company decisions. Most significantly, Melody had used her remaining shares to establish the Harper Foundation, dedicated to educational opportunities for underrepresented groups in aviation and transportation industries. "The quarterly numbers came in this morning," James said, handing Melody a tablet displaying financial projections. Revenue up 12% year-over-year. Employee retention at 97%, highest in company history. "And how's Richard's lawsuit going?" Melody asked, returning the tablet. James chuckled. "Dismissed last week. The judge ruled that his undisclosed meetings with National constituted a clear breach of fiduciary duty. He's banned from serving on any public company board for 5 years." They walked together through the hangar, greeting maintenance crew members by name, a practice James had maintained throughout his career and that Melody had adopted during her increasing involvement with day-to-day operations. The scholarship committee is meeting this afternoon, Melody noted, consulting her schedule. 20 new recipients selected for next fall. The Employee Family Scholarship Program, once used by Richard as a weapon against James, had been expanded under their joint leadership, with Melody personally endowing an additional fund specifically for first-generation college students. "I heard Marcus Chen accepted the CTO position at National Airways," James mentioned as they exited the hangar into bright Georgia sunshine. "Good for him," Melody replied sincerely. "They need someone who understands how technology can support people rather than replace them." Their professional relationship had evolved into a genuine friendship over the months of working together, their initial antagonism replaced by mutual respect. James's operational expertise complemented Melody's marketing background, creating a leadership dynamic that balanced innovation with stability. As they approached the terminal building where they would conduct employee orientation for new hires, Melody's thoughts drifted back to that fateful flight 6 months earlier, when a seating dispute had cascaded into a corporate power struggle with far-reaching implications. "I've been thinking about that first day," she said as they paused outside the terminal entrance. "How differently things might have gone if either of us had made different choices." James nodded thoughtfully. "If I had insisted more firmly on keeping my seat. Or if I had checked both boarding passes more carefully before making assumptions. Or if flight attendant training had better addressed unconscious bias." The what-ifs were endless, but ultimately less important than what had actually transpired, and what they had built from that inauspicious beginning. Inside the orientation room, 30 new Skyline employees, representing diverse backgrounds, ages, and experience levels, waited for the leadership welcome that began every new hire training. James took his position at the front of the room, with Melody alongside him rather than behind or in front, a subtle but intentional physical representation of their collaborative approach. "Welcome to Skyline Airways," James began, his resonant voice immediately commanding attention. "My name is James Washington, and I serve as your CEO. This is Melody Harper, majority shareholder and co-chair of our Diversity and Inclusion Initiative." Melody smiled at the group of new hires. Skyline has a unique history, one that includes both discriminatory practices in our past and tremendous progress in our present. We begin every orientation by acknowledging that history, because understanding where we've been helps us chart a better course for the future. Over the next hour, they outline the company's journey, from Franklin Harper's gentleman's agreement excluding minorities from leadership to the employee ownership structure that now gave every worker a stake in Skyline's success. "The airline industry was built on exclusion," James explained. "From executives to pilots to flight attendants, artificial barriers kept many talented individuals from advancing based solely on their background. Skyline is committed to breaking down those barriers," Melody continued. "Not just because it's morally right, but because our success proves it's good business. Diverse perspectives lead to better decision-making. Inclusive policies lead to higher employee retention. Equitable practices lead to stronger performance." As the orientation session concluded, Melody watched the new employees file out, many stopping to shake hands with James or ask follow-up questions. The energy in the room was palpable, excitement about joining a company known throughout the industry for both its performance and its principles. Later that afternoon, Melody found herself in a familiar setting. The first-class cabin of a Skyline flight from Atlanta to Newark. As passengers boarded, she observed the flight attendants carefully checking boarding passes and seat assignments, implementing the improved procedures that had emerged from her own experience months earlier. From her window seat, Melody noticed James boarding the same flight, heading to New York for industry meetings they would both attend. He nodded politely as he passed her row, continuing to his own assigned seat. Minutes later, as the boarding process continued, Melody observed James quietly offering his first-class seat to an elderly woman who was struggling with the walk to the main cabin. The woman's surprise and gratitude were evident as James helped her settle in before taking her economy seat without fanfare or expectation of recognition. The simple act of consideration, unrelated to race or status, simply human kindness, epitomized the culture they were building together at Skyline. One where people were valued, where assumptions were questioned, and where leadership meant service rather than privilege. As the flight took off, Melody reflected on how a moment of confrontation had led to personal and corporate transformation. She had nearly become an instrument of exclusion, unwittingly perpetuating her grandfather's prejudice. Instead, she had found an opportunity to acknowledge that legacy while actively working to create something better. The aircraft banked gently as it climbed through scattered clouds, revealing the Atlanta skyline below, a complex tapestry of buildings, neighborhoods, and communities interconnected despite their differences. Much like the company she now helped lead. What's your take on this story? Do you think corporations can truly transform their cultures, or are changes like skylines only possible in fiction? Comment below with your thoughts. If you found this story meaningful, please like, subscribe, and share it with others who might appreciate its message about confronting bias and creating more inclusive spaces. Thank you for joining me on this journey through corporate America's struggles with race and privilege. Until next time, remember that meaningful change often begins with a single uncomfortable confrontation. This story highlights how unconscious bias can shape our actions in profound ways. Melody's initial assumption about James reflected deep-seated societal prejudices that privilege whiteness in professional settings. Her journey shows that acknowledging biases is only the first step. Active work is required to dismantle discriminatory systems. We also see how corporate structures often perpetuate inequality through neutral policies designed to maintain existing power dynamics. James's approach demonstrates that changing systems from within requires both strategic patience and decisive action when opportunities arise. Perhaps most importantly, the story illustrates that transformation begins with personal accountability. Melody could have doubled down on her mistake or ignored her grandfather's legacy of discrimination. Instead, she chose to confront uncomfortable truths and use her inherited privilege to create more equitable systems. Real change happens when those with power choose to share it, when companies value diverse perspectives not just for appearances but because inclusion leads to better decisions, and when individuals recognize that addressing historical injustice strengthens rather than diminishes collective progress.